order. Martyn Day to move the motion.
I beg to move that this House has considered E-petition 608056, nationalise energy companies, that closed on the 9th of August and attracted over 109,000 signatures, including over 200 from my own constituency. It is a pleasure to see you in the chair for this debate, Mrs Murray, and I am grateful for the opportunity to present on this very important and prevailing issue. So prevailing, in fact, that within 1 week of this petition closing, another one with the same title was opened. So I would encourage anyone who supports the call for the government to take back ownership of strategic energy assets to consider taking the opportunity to sign the new petition, because this is clearly an issue which is not going away anytime soon and will undoubtedly see Parliament asked to revisit it. The new petition will remain open until the 1st of March next year. Before moving on to the essence of this debate, I firstly want to thank the signatories, particularly David Abrahams Edley, for starting it. It is David's action that brought us here today for what I'm sure will be an enlightening discussion. It is worth mentioning that David's petition was started in February of this year, just after the substantial price cap increase was announced by Ofgem, Great Britain's energy regulator. This was a rise of 54% from the 1st of April. However, that it was started before an additional eye-watering rise of 80% from the 1st of October was announced shows a foresightedness that appears to have largely escaped this government. I will say more about this later. The petitioners call for the government to take back ownership of strategic energy assets and accept that the free market has failed the energy sector. They believe it is in the national interest to renationalise our energy assets because even back in February, people were having to choose whether to heat or eat. Yes, certainly.
Thank you, my honourable friend, for giving way. In August, the Financial Times estimated that the cost of the public purse could have reached £4 billion by spring next year if a buyer for bulb was not found, while transfer of ownership has now been agreed. Does the honourable member share my concerns that bailing out privately owned companies in this way could have a catastrophic impact on public finances, where nationalising could have in fact been much cheaper?
My honourable friend makes a very good point, and I think it is reasonable for us to say that UK governments of all stripes have seen the system of privatised energy companies, which is deeply dysfunctional, and we are where we are today. We need to get out of the hole that we are in. It goes without saying that the situation people are now facing has worsened considerably, with inflation exceeding 10% in September, its highest rate in 40 years. I think it would be helpful here if we quickly remind ourselves what a free market is or is meant to be. Voluntary exchanges taking place which account for supply and demand. It is the basis of an economic system without government intervention, with a key feature being the absence of coerced transactions or conditions on transactions. But we all know free market economies do not exist in the real world because all markets are constrained in one way or another. Ofgem and the introduction of the price cap being the obvious interventions in what we are debating here today. And that is before the current energy crisis triggered even more interventions. So when the opening paragraph of the government's response to the petition states, properly regulated markets provide the best outcome for consumers as a driver of efficiency and innovation, it raises various questions. Clearly, consumers are not benefiting from the best outcome. Does that therefore signal that the free market has indeed failed the energy sector as the petitioners believe? Or does it point to the energy market not being properly regulated? Either way, something is not working. And I wonder if the Minister can tell us today what the government can do to fix it if he does not agree that nationalisation is the right approach. It is reported that economists who measure the degree of freedom in markets have found a generally positive relationship between free markets and measures of economic well-being. Unfortunately, most people in the UK are not enjoying economic well-being. We only have to look at the end of the government response that details what is described as the unprecedented scale of financial support the UK government is providing to see this. Consequently, while government intervention in this regard is welcome, indeed necessary, it also serves as evidence that the free market has failed the energy sector, as the petitioners say. At this point, I think a bit of background about the government action in relation to the current energy crisis would also be helpful. We likely all remember the Right Honourable Member for Richmond's proposed solution to help the situation at the time was to reduce every domestic electricity bill by £200 and then recover it over a 5-year period. This initial intervention refers to the token gestures of mandatory loans mentioned in the petition. In case of those confused by the revolving doors at the top of this government, the Right Honourable Member for Richmond was the Chancellor in post when David's petition was started, not the third Prime Minister that we have seen this year as he is today. Thankfully, this part of the petition was addressed by the then Chancellor, and his so-called "a loan, not loan" was ditched and replaced by the Energy Bills Support Scheme, where domestic electricity consumers were to receive £400 of support with their energy bills, paid as a grant over 6 months, starting from the beginning of this month. Then, our second Prime Minister of this year, the Honourable Member for South West Norfolk, announced the 2-year energy price guarantee, an intervention in an intervention, which superseded the proposed energy price cap increase of 80% and limited the price that suppliers can charge customers for units of gas from the 1st of October. This move was, of course, widely welcomed, not least as the Honourable Member for South West Norfolk was reported to be acting so people and businesses are supported over the next 2 years, but it was simultaneously criticised for being misleading. A UK government press release on the 8th of September stated, "A typical UK household will pay no more than £2,500 a year on their energy bill for the next 2 years from the 1st of October. However, the money-saving expert Martyn Lewis, who is arguably the most trusted man in Britain, commented, "I've seen a lot of confusion, so let me start by saying there's no maximum energy bill." And, not surprisingly, that confusion continues. Exactly 2 weeks ago, the Right Honourable Member for South West Surrey, our 4th Chancellor this year so far, announced that instead of the lasting 2 years, the energy price guarantee would only last until April next year, meaning that in just over 5 months, many could be placed back on the energy regulator Ofgem's price cap. According to energy analysts Cornwall Insight, this means another massive hike in bills for millions of people. The current prediction under Ofgem's existing cap methodology is 74% more than the energy price guarantee. I hope you are all keeping up with the government actions that have been taken so far to manage the UK's energy crisis. I believe that recapping on these very recent events will demonstrate that the energy crisis could have been handled in a more straightforward way if strategic energy assets were not open to the free market economy but owned by the government, as the petitioners call for. In the previously mentioned UK government press release of the 8th of September, the Honourable Member for South West Norfolk was reported to say, "Decades of short-term thinking on energy has failed to focus enough on securing supply." I'm sure this is a sentiment that the petitioners would wholeheartedly agree with. Indeed, they call for a 25-year strategic plan. However, like me, I don't think they would agree that launching a new oil and gas licensing round and lifting the moratorium on UK shale gas production was the way forward. This is regressive and builds on the nonsensical investment allowance, which unbelievably incentivises investment in fossil fuel extraction instead of in a just transition. Investment in energy security should be targeted at renewables, carbon capture and storage, and our net zero future. Has this government forgotten its commitments made to the world at COP26 last November? Additionally, the press release was entitled, "Government announces energy price guarantee for families and businesses while urgently taking action to reform broken energy market." If the reference to a broken energy market does not align with the petitioner's claim that the free market has failed the energy sector, I fail to see what would. Returning to an earlier question I posed about whether the energy market is being properly regulated, can the Minister, also explain why the government response states it continues to believe that properly regulated markets provide the best outcome for customers and promote market competition as the best driver of efficiency, innovation and value. Aside from the fact that market competition has all but disappeared with the removal of lower priced tariffs from the market and around 24 million out of 28 million households being on the standard variable tariffs at the end of August, I don't think that people across the UK believe they are getting value from the energy market, not least because of the punishing standing charges before even a kilowatt of power is used. Yeah. Perhaps the Minister can come up with something to change my mind on that. The government response also mentions that properly regulated markets incentivise private capital to invest in the energy system. My basic understanding of investment is that private capital is invested to make money for the people who have money to invest in the first place. Yeah. Would it not, therefore, make more sense if the energy assets were in public ownership, so that the return on its investment would come back to the public purse and not the coffers of the energy companies? Of course, the temporary energy profits levy gains 25% of profits from oil and gas firms, and it is reported it will raise $5 billion in its first year. That will help. But does the Minister agree that 100% of profits would help more? The government response mentioned that if it renationalised energy companies, the British taxpayer would have to compensate directors, shareholders and creditors to the tune of tens of billions of pounds, money that would be better spent supporting families. And this is where I return to the government's lack of foresightedness. Has the government considered that the taxpayer has already been saddled with the burden of paying for its cost of living support for years to come? Has any assessment been done to compare a one-off payment to directors, shareholders and creditors to the repeated ongoing costs that have been forced upon the taxpayer? Why should the public be paying for energy costs while companies rake in significant increases in profits earned from UK oil and gas extraction? Indeed, the Chief Executive of Shell said earlier this month, the solution should not be government intervention, but protection of those who need protection. And that was before Shell's third quarter profits of $9.5 billion were reported just last week. Eye-watering profits for the super-rich compared to eye-watering bills for those who can least afford it. The government is making the rich richer at the expense of low and middle-income households. Can it take immediate and prudent action to protect those most impacted by this energy crisis now and in the future? You know, I am reminded of the famous George Bernard Shaw quote, "Success does not consist of never making mistakes, but in never making the same one a second time." So can the Minister convince me, David and the other petitioners that the government's refusal to nationalise the country's strategic energy assets is not in fact an ideological blind spot? A nationalised energy sector would have the potential to deliver an integrated approach, guiding the country away from its dependency on unstable fossil fuels, thereby tackling climate change whilst at the same time protecting consumers. Is this government capable of using some foresight? I feel I have barely scratched on the issues surrounding today's petition, but I look forward to hearing the contributions from the other speakers in the debate, and I look particularly favourably to hearing what the Minister says in response. Thank you.
Well done, Mark. Question is that this House has considered E-petition 608056 relating to public ownership of energy companies. Margaret Greenwood.
Ms Murray, for calling me, and it's an honour to share and speak under your chairmanship this afternoon. I'd like to pay tribute to everybody who signed the petition that we're debating today. Energy is a necessity for all of us, yet people are at the mercy of big business when it comes to who can afford to heat their homes or run their businesses. Profits at the world's biggest oil companies have soared to nearly £150 billion so far this year. At the same time, and as the petition that we're discussing today acknowledges, people are having to choose between heating and eating. This cannot be right. As Lord Seeker has written, It is Christmas every day for oil and gas companies, and their shareholders and executives are laughing all the way to the bank, leaving the rest of us to pick up the cost in higher energy prices, inflation, bankruptcies and a deepening cost of living crisis. Labour called for a windfall tax on oil and gas back in January so that some of the eye-watering profits that are being raked off by big business could support people to pay their bills. Yet it took months for the government to U-turn and follow Labour's lead. And even then, the then Chancellor, now Prime Minister, could not resist resorting to his instinct to put big business first and everyone else last. And he allowed these energy giants to shield most of their profits from the very levy that he was announcing. The Energy, Oil and Gas Profits Levy, which the current Prime Minister himself designed, allows energy companies to apply for tax savings worth 91 pence for every £1 invested in fossil fuel extraction in the UK. Promoting fossil fuel extraction instead of investment in renewables is irresponsible as we face a climate emergency, and it is an insult to young people and to future generations. Labour has called for the tax to be tightened to remove the option for energy firms to claim tax relief on 91% of the levy if the money is reinvested. Also notable is that during the passage of the Energy Profits Levy Act, the government voted against Labour's new clause, which would have required an assessment within 3 months of the bill becoming law of how much extra revenue would have been raised if the levy had been introduced on the 9th of January 2022 rather than the 26th of May 2022. The 9th of January is significant because that is when Labour first called for a windfall tax, 4.5 months before the government came forward with their U-turn. So why did it take the government so long to act? I would be grateful if the Minister could respond on that point. There have been reports over the weekend that the windfall tax on energy companies could be raised to 30% and extend by 3 years, and perhaps the Minister could give us more information today and let us know what discussions have taken place in government about that. So it's clear that there's a need for long-term change where energy is concerned. As the independent campaign group We Own It has highlighted, of the top 10 countries in the world who are leading the energy transition to renewables, only the United Kingdom does not have a publicly owned renewable energy generation company. Of those that do, Sweden owns 100% of Vattenfall, one of Europe's largest producers of electricity and heat. Norway is 100% of Statkraft, Europe's largest renewable energy producer. Switzerland owns 100% of Axpo, the country's largest producer of renewable energy. Iceland owns 100% of Landsverken, the country's largest electricity generator. France will soon own 100% of EDF, a world leader in low-carbon electricity generation, and of course a company that many of us in this country use, despite the fact that the French people will own 100% of it fairly shortly. The other countries, Denmark, Austria, Finland and New Zealand, all own at least 50% of renewable energy generation companies. So there's a lot of public support for the United Kingdom to go down a similar path to those other countries, because of course there are no profits for shareholders in a publicly owned energy company. A poll for We Own It carried out by Survation found that 66% of those surveyed wanted energy in public ownership. Earlier this month, it was reported that a YouGov poll found that 55% of more than 1,700 adults who were surveyed across Great Britain favoured public ownership of energy. And in August, a poll by 38 Degrees found that 73% of voters would favour temporarily renationalising energy companies if they cannot offer lower bills. Public ownership of services is understandably very popular, whether that be energy, water, buses, trains or the NHS. And I would just say the NHS, for example, has been massively opened up to the private sector on the Conservatives' watch, with billions of pounds of taxpayers' money being handed to private companies to treat NHS patients. Privatisation is never a guarantee of quality. According to a study by the University of Oxford, private sector outsourcing in the NHS corresponded with significantly increased rates of treatable mortality, potentially as a result of a decline in the quality of healthcare services. So to return to energy, Commonwealth reported recently that 72% of voters think it is a good idea for the government to set up an energy company which is government-owned and aims to create low-cost, environmentally friendly energy. Labour has announced a plan to establish Great British Energy, a new publicly owned clean generation company that will harness the power of the sun, wind and waves to cut energy bills and deliver energy security and independence for our country, as well as delivering good, secure and high-paid jobs. Among other things, I would indeed.
In September, in a response to a written parliamentary question on an impact assessment for nationalisation, the then responsible minister said the government does not intend to make such an assessment. Nationalisation will not solve the current challenge of high global fossil fuel prices and the impact this is having on the cost of energy. Does the honourable member agree that it's difficult to see how ministers can speak with such certainty on this matter if they will not even make a full assessment?
Thank the honourable member for her intervention. It's a really interesting point that she raises because, to me, it speaks of the ideology rather than taking a practical approach to what needs to happen in terms of securing our energy and making sure our energy costs come down. I thank her for that. Labour has announced a plan to establish Great British Energy, a new publicly owned clean generation company that will harness the power of the sun, wind and waves to cut energy bills and deliver energy security and independence for our country, as well as delivering good, secure and high-paid jobs. Among other things, GB Energy will enable long-term investments in a range of new and emerging technologies. It will also ensure that homegrown research and development leads to domestic manufacturing and nurturing partnerships with small and medium-sized enterprises and large local employers. It will enable the UK to retain the strategic assets we need to build national resilience. To reiterate a point that I made earlier, of the 10 countries in the world who are leading the clean energy transition, only the UK does not have a public generation company. The government really should reflect on that and be bold, as Labour would be in government.
Thank you, Mrs Murray, and it's a real pleasure to serve under your chairship, and it's a real pleasure to follow my honourable friend who as always makes such a compelling case for public ownership. I was very pleased she also mentioned the escalating privatisation of the National Health Service, something she's worked very hard to expose. It seems to me and to many others that the government has an ideological opposition to public ownership, that no matter what the evidence, no matter what the reality, no matter what the public opinion, the government will resist public ownership. Let's take a look at this petition which has secured this debate today. 109,000 people signed this petition, showing the strength of support there is for bringing energy into public ownership. And a Survation poll this year showed that not a bare majority of the public, but 66% of the public believe that energy should be in public ownership. And that includes a majority of Conservative Party voters and maybe even members too. So we've got a situation where the energy sector is being used as a cash cow for shareholders. We've got an energy system which is privatised at every single stage, whether it be generation, transmission, distribution, supply, and that means that at every opportunity, profits are extracted so there are higher bills for ordinary people, extracted so there is less investment, extracted so there's a worse service, and extracted with the result of failing to make the green transition. Let's take the big 6 energy suppliers. Commonwealth shows that £47 billion in dividends and share buybacks have occurred since 2010. Money that should have been in a public system, but it goes much deeper than that. Even the National Grid is paying billions out each year in dividends. It's lose-lose for everyone. That is, apart from those who own our system. And who does own energy? Other states have bought our system, like EDF, for example, and so have billionaires. Northern Power Grid is owned by the US billionaire Warren Buffett. UK Power Networks is owned by the Hong Kong billionaire Li Ka-shing. And the high prices aren't just about the global crisis, because of course we're in a global crisis, but privatisation makes this much worse. In other countries, in many other countries, energy bills haven't increased like they have here. Their governments are using public ownership as a tool to help people. In France, for example, publicly owned EDF kept energy bill rises to just 4% in April 2022, while our prices soared and soared and soared. Norway has been paying 80% of people's bills above a capped price. And anyway, even before the current energy crisis began, domestic energy bills steadily increased by 50% in real terms, i.e. inflation adjusted, from 1996 to 2018. So we see, and people out there feel, what privatisation means in practice. In practice, privatisation of our energy system means higher bills than needed. Research shows that prices are 20 to 30% lower in systems with public ownership. Privatisation means in practice wasting vital funds on money lining the pockets of shareholders. And privatisation means in practice failing to invest enough in connecting renewable energy to the grid, with the needs of the current fossil fuel firms put first. So what is the way forward? I think this petition, signed by well over 100,000 people, shows the way forward. The way forward is to nationalise the big five energy supply retail companies, most of which are just owned by bigger companies anyway. And I very much welcome the plan from the TUC setting out how a publicly owned energy retail system could deliver a social pricing structure that lets everyone afford the energy they need to cook, clean and stay warm all year round, while the wealthiest with extravagant energy use pay more per unit. The way forward also is to bring the privatised monopolies of the national grid and regional distribution into public ownership, to help us prepare for the energy transition that we need. The way forward must include introducing permanent and high windfall taxes on North Sea oil and gas companies that use the revenues to cut people's bills, invest in renewable energy and pay for further nationalisation policies that will benefit the country. Create a new state-owned renewable energy company to ensure that the errors of privatisation are not repeated into the future. And it's useful that we reflect upon the fact that 9 out of 10 countries leading on green transition have a state-owned company leading the way on renewables. We can't have a situation where, due to ideological dogma and the kind of hero worship of the Thatcher period, we become fixated on continuing privatisation and defending privatisation. As someone once said, what matters is what works. Public ownership works. Privatisation has failed. Let's have an energy system that puts people and planet before profit. If we do, that's a good way to set about helping to get people through this cost of living crisis and making way for a better, greener, fairer, more decent future.
Sam Tarry.
Thank you very much, Mrs Murray. It's an honour to speak under your chairmanship for the first time today. This winter, more than 3/4 of UK households will face fuel poverty, and many will have to make impossible choices whether they put food on the table or keep lights on. We're now at this dystopian point where local councils are forced to open warm banks to prevent people from freezing to death in their own beds. And unfortunately, this is the harsh reality for many across the country, even long before this current crisis. Indeed, the UK is ranked 6th highest in long-term rates of excess winter mortality out of 30 European countries. That's literally thousands of people dying from fuel poverty due to extreme costs every single winter. And according to research from National Energy Action, the UK experiences on average 32,000 deaths in each December to March period, more than mortality rates across the rest of the year. And of these, 9,700 of these deaths are directly attributable to the avoidable circumstances of living in a cold home. About the same as the number of people who die from breast or prostate cancer each year. How shocking is that, Chairman? The scale of the surge in fuel bills represents the gravest threat to living standards since the Second World War. This winter, as fuel poverty skyrockets and inflation hits a decade-high peak, the impact on families cannot be understated. Unless dramatic action is taken by this government, countless people could even die again. And that responsibility will be on this government and their friends in the energy lobby's hands. Thinking locally, Madam Chairman, my inbox is full of desperate pleas from my constituents, from carers, pensioners, local businesses, everyday people who haven't the slightest clue how they're going to survive or their business will survive this winter. And sadly, they feel incredibly let down by the people in this House and this government. They think their pleas are not being recognised, heard or even valued. Ilford is a proud and diverse working class community. I've lived there and worked there most of my life. I'm proud to still call it home now. It represents the best of our country, its diversity, its industry, its entrepreneurialism and its communal spirit. But working class communities like this are suffering, left behind to freeze this winter. This government tells us, though, Madam Chairman, that during this crisis we must all tighten our belts and be prepared to make tough decisions and sacrifices. Why, though? Every single time do these tough decisions seem to fall on working class people, when many at the top seem to think that things have never been so good. Let's take this year's Britain's oil and gas giants, who will take home record profits. Shell announced last week they'd made profits of £8 billion, double those of the same period as last year, and in August the Big Five posted quarterly profits of £50 billion. They are profiteering literally off the backs of unimaginable suffering for millions in the UK, paying out huge multi-billion pound dividends, bonuses to their wealthy shareholders, and this is an immense cost. It's hurting people. It's not just that they're running an exemplary service that they should be rewarded for. While supporters of privatisation may claim that it benefits consumers and lowers prices, in fact the opposite has in fact occurred. Even before the current energy crisis, domestic energy bills had increased by 50% since the time it was first privatised by Margaret Thatcher. The UK energy industry is now so bloated, so out of touch, so unable to cope, so unable to deliver for the citizens of this country. I would argue that in fact it's stifled innovation and it's held back the fight against climate change. And because of this market that's so desperately out of control, the UK has lost a decade of potential progress on decarbonising buildings and leaves the task of decarbonising before it's too late all the more challenging. And it's hardly cost effective for the taxpayer. Since June 2021, this government has spent more than £2.7 billion bailing out these failing energy companies. This is indeed a great energy rip-off, sparking palpable public outrage, people potentially organising over WhatsApp and the internet about not paying their bills in the same way as the revolts against the poll tax in the 80s. People are sick and tired, being taken for mugs, and the ultra-rich ransacking the economy, making even more money on a daily basis. But clearly there is an alternative. Private UK energy providers must be replaced, in my view, by a single publicly owned energy company run in a way that would involve workers and, more importantly as well, consumers alike. It's the right thing to do for the families who have been suffering for so long. Bring those energy companies into public ownership, or indeed, as Labour have proposed, starting a new one that could begin to take control and offer better services for all at cheaper prices. It would allow us to put a freeze on any further price increases for the remainder of the existing Parliament, at least until the end of 2024. There could be cuts to current charges and a moratorium on disconnections that could be then delivered by that company. Bringing that energy companies into public hands would also generate huge revenues for the state. TUC analysis shows the government is missing out on £63 billion to potentially as much as £122 billion of direct income over the next 2 years due to the past decisions to privatise power plants and then the resulting lack of UK public ownership of electricity generation. It would truly put Britain back at the heart of the battle against climate change. The biggest issue currently facing humanity, indeed the election in Brazil partly won on that basis. Research by We Own It found that state-owned utilities invest far more in renewables. It can make use of the state's ability to plan for the long term, ensure that more ambitious climate targets become a reality. UK public energy could accelerate the deployment of new clean power. It can include developing new technologies where the private sector is slow to scale up, or pump priming the private sector to get with the programme, such as floating offshore wind or zero-carbon hydrogen. This would also deliver thousands of good, green, unionised jobs. Evidence commissioned by the GMB union suggests that where public bodies invest in renewables directly, orders are far more likely to be placed through UK supply chains, ensuring that all benefit from the climate transition. And with 9 out of 10 countries leading the green transition, having a state-owned company of some description, why are we always choosing, through sheer ideology, to do something different that could work for our country and for our people? Madam Chair, the energy companies have proven time after time they cannot be trusted to keep bills at affordable levels and to keep executive pay under control. Public ownership could generate billions for the Treasury. It could be the linchpin for a genuinely revolutionary green industrial strategy, a strategy that could deliver jobs, transform communities from the top of Scotland to the bottom of Cornwall, and it could protect millions across the country from the very worst whims of disaster capitalists looking to make a quick buck out of the suffering of others. You know, 66% of the public believe that energy should be brought into public hands. I hope the government and his government minister and His Majesty's government will listen and take action. It is within their hands to be able to make a difference on this issue. But I strongly suspect, Madam Chairman, there will be a Labour government, an incoming, hopefully soon Labour government, will begin to deliver the change that this country really needs. Yeah. Thank you very much.
Alan Brown, SNP spokesman.
It's a pleasure to serve under you as chair. I also commend the petitioner because it's quite clear we do need serious debate about energy, strategic assets and how the energy market operates. It seems to me for too long what constituted a so-called debate in this place was that private is good, nationalise the public sector is bad, or a vice versa argument. Now, unfortunately, it doesn't seem there's too much of a debate in here today either, because most of the speakers so far seem to be in broad agreement, and it does beg the question, where are all these compassionate Conservatives bringing forward their views in this debate and sticking up for what's going on and putting forward other ideas? And I can see from a secretary position somebody's pointing to Minister. I'd like to state the obvious, the Minister has to respond, and yeah, we'll get his point of view, but where are all the Conservative backbenchers? Anyway, I commend my friend, Honourable Member for Linlithgow and East Falkirk for bringing this debate forward on behalf of the petitioners in a balanced way, whilst also highlighting the abject failures of this UK government. Honourable Fenn rightly has pointed out that to date the free market has effectively collapsed and failed, and there's been insufficient regulation over the years, or else, as he said, it was a properly regulated market, the citizens of the UK would feel the benefit of that proper regulated market and there wouldn't be such high levels of fuel poverty. He clearly highlighted the problems exacerbated by Chancellors coming and going, Prime Ministers coming and going, and the fact that the current Prime Minister was the then Chancellor that had no idea the scale of the problem and tried to introduce the £200 energy loan scheme that was clearly never going to address the issues that real people are facing as they struggle to pay their energy bills. Another point he made on behalf of the petitioner is the need for a 25-year strategic plan. I certainly agree with that. Actually, what we should be looking at in the long term is how do we get to net zero? What do we need to do to get there? Where should we be building the generation facilities to facilitate that and to do it in the cheapest possible way, and what grid upgrades do we need to get there, and what other measures should be implemented, such as energy efficiency and upgrading homes properly. That would be a long-term planning, and that would realise the most benefits for people in the UK. Also heard from the Honourable Member for Wirral West, who also highlighted effectively the dilemma many people now have, heating or eating, or sadly in some cases they can afford to do neither because they can't even turn on their gas oven or gas hobs to actually heat their food. Highlighted the failings in design of the oil and gas profits levy and the obscene oil and gas profits that are currently being realised, and that's clearly another common theme from all speakers. It's interesting, the Honourable Member for Wirral West rightly highlighted the success of smaller countries, such as, for example, Norway, Denmark, Iceland, etc., in terms of public ownership and leading the way in the renewable transition, and that is not lost in us MPs from Scotland, I have to say. We heard from an Honourable Member for Leeds East, and again, he challenged, some of the challenge he put forward was who actually owns the energy companies at the moment. We keep hearing the UK government talk about energy security, and yet they're quite happy to have so many foreign owners over energy companies. So there's a real paradox there. And I note that in the last written question I submitted about stake of the consortium to build Sizewell C, there's still a 20% stake owned by China General Nuclear. So when is the government going to realise that that partnership should be absolved and actually need to end their obsession with Sizewell C anyway? John Wem for Leeds East also mentioned social pricing structure, or I would call it social tariffs, and I certainly think now is the time that this really needs to be considered going forward. We really do need to have layered tiers based on usage, because we all know the people in the lowest incomes use the least amount of energy, so they benefit from that. But also we can use social tariffs to protect the most vulnerable, and it's a much more progressive way, because those that can afford to pay more do pay more for the energy they use. And finally, in terms of backbench contributions, we heard from the Honourable Member for Ilford South, who started off with the eye-watering figures about the tragic consequences of fuel poverty. The reality being, Miss Murray, that fuel poverty kills people. Roughly 10,000 people a year dying prematurely because they can't afford to heat their homes. That's a national scandal, and one that really needs to be remembered. And that's something I'd like the Minister to answer and how they think they're going to address that going forward, because we can't let this scandal continue. And clearly it's going to get worse as fuel poverty rates have increased massively. So has the government even assessed what that means in future excess deaths? So, Miss Murray, a year and a half ago, the so-called price cap was £1,100 per annum for an average household. And now people are supposed to be expected to be grateful for the support package that the government announced, which is an equivalent to £2,500 per annum for an average household. Now, my honourable friend for Linlithgow and Falkirk East, he also highlighted that the former Prime Minister didn't even understand her own policy and kept stating that she was making sure people will not pay more than £2,500 for their bills. Miss Murray, with average bills in Scotland likely to be £3,300 even under this support scheme, this shows the gravity of her misinformation, and too many people will be under an illusion their bills will be smaller than what they're actually going to pay, and frankly it's dangerous in terms of financial management for people. Now, the government's own impact assessment for the energy price bill estimated that their support package is going to prevent average bills rising to over £4,400 come January 2023. And the previous Prime Minister, she was claiming that the support package was going to prevent energy bills rising to over £6,000 per annum. Now, given the UK government made the last-minute decision to slash the support period, can the government minister advise what does he think Ofgem's cap level is going to increase to for the 22 million or so dual fuel customers that are currently in standard variable tariffs when the support package ends in April 2023? And when is the government going to announce their plan to protect the most vulnerable? Because they claim they will protect the most vulnerable. The reality is more and more people are already in debt and they're being put onto prepayment meters. So why is the government support package not even contingent and not forcing more people onto prepayment meters which have higher standing charges? Now, National Energy Action estimate that with the current support package, there's still going to be 6.7 million households in fuel poverty. So can the government minister provide an estimate for how many people they think will go into fuel poverty come April 2023 when the support package ends? How many households does the government think are vulnerable enough to merit further support, and when are we going to hear what that support package looks like? So, Ms Murray, clearly with this scale of fuel poverty, this is why people are angry and they want this more serious debate about the merits of nationalisation and putting people before profits. They know the energy profits levied for oil and gas companies doesn't go far enough, and that the investment allowance of 91p in the pound actually now incentivises investment in fossil fuel over renewable energy, which is a perverse incentive. And if you look back, for too long in the energy retail sector, the excess profits being made by the big six was actually deemed acceptable by the government. So when they eventually moved to a price cap, the truth was that price cap come in too late, because by that time the market was getting squeezed by new entrants who thought they could come in and make easy money in the energy retail sector. 30 companies have went bust since July 2021, and many of these companies had been using customers' money for their cash flow, effectively operating their own Ponzi schemes, while the government and the regulator were sleeping on the job. But the reality is, and unfortunately, it's bill payers who are now picking up the tab for these losses and covering the customer credit that these companies effectively stole. So why hasn't there been stronger action to bring the guilty of these companies to account? Now, the largest company to go into administration, as the Honourable Member for Rutherglen had pointed out, was Bulb Energy, who have now cost the taxpayer billions of pounds. What is the government's estimate of the special administration regime costs for Bulb Energy? What we've actually seen in this energy market, or the retail market particularly, like some other markets, particularly the rail market, is what we're seeing is the profits are privatised, but the debts and the risk lies with the people. How can that be a fair system? Now, regards Bulb, while they're in special administration regime, the chief executive was still allowed to pick up his £250,000 a year salary, supposedly for his expertise, the same man whose expertise took the company into administration. So only a government that sees lifting bankers' bonuses a priority can think that chief executive still should have been kept in place with a £250,000 salary. Ms Murray, another example of privatising profit while the taxpayers taking risk is what I touched on earlier, the government's obsession with new nuclear power. Hinkley Point C is already nearly 50% over budget, and EDF's latest programme shows it could be 2030 before both units are operating, which is 5 years behind schedule. And yet the government still tells us that building another of these, replicating the world's most expensive power station at Sizewell, is the answer to our cost and security crisis. It actually beggars belief that they want to give EDF a 60-year contract, but moving the risk onto the bill payers under the regulated asset-based model of funding. Now, this is a project that the government's own impact assessment shows that it could cost £63 billion for capital and borrowing costs. So here we have a classic example where the free market in nuclear energy generation has failed completely, but yet the government is stepping into the market to support a fully nationalised French company and transfer the risk to the UK bill payers. And this is what frustrates me, Ms Murray. Labour continues to goad the Tories to build even more nuclear power. It's groupthink madness, and it's actually tying up future generations of bill payers to pay not just for these new costly stations, but also the nuclear waste legacy, a legacy already estimated to cost about £140 billion. How is that going to reduce bills in the future? Now, switching slightly, if we look to Scotland, Ms Murray, Scotland provides an example of a nationalised utility company that's kept all assets under public ownership, and that's Scottish Water. Water and sewerage bills are cheaper in Scotland compared to the rest of the UK water companies. Comparative performance is better when measured by the regulator, and of course any surpluses or savings are reinvested. Now, by contrast, the privatised water companies south of the border have taken something like £60 billion in dividends since privatisation, and as we know, sewage discharges into rivers and seas are out of control by these private water companies. So would the Minister care to comment on the comparative success of the nationalised utility company in Scotland and advise what lessons can be learned from that? But in a similar vein, what assessment has the government made of the dividends paid out in the energy sector over the years with regard to risk and balance, and whether these dividends made by the energy companies have indeed been excessive? Now, Ms Murray, when you look at the oil and gas industry elsewhere, we actually see what nationalised companies have achieved in terms of returns for the benefit of their citizens. Norway had Statoil generating profits for the citizens of Norway, while the Norwegian government still took taxes and put some of that aside in a sovereign wealth fund, a wealth fund that now sits at $1 trillion, the largest in the world. That energy company, now Equinor, operates in 30 countries around the world, has massively diversified into renewable energy, and while it was technically privatised, the Norwegian state is still the majority shareholder with a 67% shareholding. It really is the ultimate success story, whereby in Scotland's case, by comparison, we know that the broad shoulders of the UK has squandered oil and gas revenues, some £380 billion worth over the years. Independence, of course, will allow a Scottish Government to create an investment fund, one that would invest in renewable energy, one that could be used to support the decarbonisation of homes, one that could take stakes in renewable generation while also levering in private investment. Ms Murray, the Energy Prices Bill gives it the Secretary of State powers to buy energy assets, so at least I'd like the Minister to answer, is this a nod away from the ideological opposition to all forms of nationalisation? And could the Minister answer, will they be using these powers to actually buy some energy assets, which the Energy Prices Bill does allow? Now, I've highlighted a lot of the benefits, Ms Murray, of public loaned assets or the success of Scottish Water, but at the moment, I have to say, I don't believe now is the right time to renationalise energy companies in full. The amount of money to pay out is untold billions and will scare off future investors and the market. The only estimates I've found on costings for this were from the Centre for Policy Studies, which accepts a right-wing think tank, so not necessarily one I would normally utilise, but they estimated previously something like £55 billion to nationalise transmission assets, but £185 overall for the entire sector. So these are eye-watering sums, and in this difficult climate, that might not be manageable. And I think the same principle applies for when Scotland does become independent. There's no point in creating additional debt and investor turbulence, but again, that doesn't preclude a Scottish energy company being set up and working in collaboration with the private sector on a mixed equity basis to ensure maximum investment gets levered in, but also the state does get returns for the good of the population and return revenue streams that allows that reinvestment. With independence, we can also end the ridiculous situation where people in the Highlands of Scotland, at the moment, they pay a surcharge on their electricity bills, while at the same time they see the renewable energy generation in the Highlands supporting the rest of the UK, bringing down bills across the UK while they pay a surcharge in their own bills. It's completely topsy-turvy and unfair, and that's something that this government refuses to address. So again, it's another inequity that it looks like only independence will resolve. Now, Scotland is an energy-rich country. We don't yet have the powers to unleash our potential and create a fairer society. But Ms Murray, I have a feeling that day is coming, and I look forward to the response from the Minister.
Before I call the Shadow Minister, I understand that people watching the debate online were unable to view the first 20 minutes of this debate. I'd like to reassure anyone watching online that the full recording of the debate will be made available online later. Shadow Minister, Mr. Alan Whitehead.
Thank you, Mrs Murray. We ought to be clear, I think, before we start any further in this debate about what this petition is calling for. I congratulate the petitioners for bringing forward this petition and indeed bringing it forward with over 100,000 signatures, 500 plus of which are from my city of Southampton. I congratulate them for bringing it forward because I think it really underlines just what a dreadful state we are in at the moment in terms of our energy provision, our energy markets, and all that goes with it. And although I take the petition to mean that the government should expropriate effectively all generation, all transmission, all distribution and all retail energy, place it with compensation into the public sphere and then run a fully nationalised energy system, in fact, effectively, as was the case 30 to 40 years ago before the privatisation experiment came into being. I can see why so many people consider that that is the brief solution to the awful mess we are in at the moment. They see that they're paying sky-high energy bills. They see that a number of energy companies at the same time are also making enormous sky-high profits, not from their ingenuity in suddenly developing new ways of delivering energy, but actually just making super profits from doing the same as they've always done, which is supplying gas into the UK markets and then passing that on for the production of power and for retail customers to pay the price for that sky-high power that is being provided. They scratch their heads about how that can be. How is it that we are paying absolutely out of the window high energy prices and people are making such enormous windfalls as they're doing it? And they scratch their heads when the government spends such a long time deciding that there should be any form of windfall levy on those companies to alleviate some of the problems of those sky-high bills, and indeed puts an enormous loophole in that windfall tax for those companies so that they get most of the money back they would pay in windfall tax if they are in a position, so they say, to undertake further exploration as far as gas and oil is concerned. And we have the grotesque result now that Shell has not...
The Honourable Gentleman is addressing through the chair.
Yes, I apologise, Samari. I will face the right way from there on. The grotesque result, as I have said, that one energy company has stated that it's actually paid no windfall levy because it's got it all back in this particular loophole, that is Shell. They see that the regulation of the system is so dreadful that actually they are paying that enormously high price for their power, as if all of it came from gas originally, even though half of it is now coming from much, much cheaper renewables, because the marginal cost of the market is regulated in such a way that gas provides the whole of the price for the market, and that's a very substantial element of why those prices are so high. In short, they've seen for themselves a thoroughly broken energy system in operation, and they've perhaps concluded that the privatised norm of the last 30 years has failed, and that placing energy back in state hands is perhaps the relatively straightforward answer. Now, the government disagrees, Ms. Murray, with this petition on these grounds, and it's a delight to see so many members of the government side in the chamber this afternoon to support this particular response to the petition. Government states it does not agree that nationalisation of energy assets is the right approach. Properly regulated markets provide the best outcome for consumers as a driver of efficiency and innovation. Wouldn't it be nice if proper regulation did drive energy efficiency and innovation? We know that it simply doesn't. We know that the failure of proper regulation is at the heart of the many problems we have in the energy markets at the moment. And we also know that the government itself has resorted to measures recently which might be compared with nationalisation. We know that the government which the honourable member for Wirral West, I think particularly mentioned that the energy company Bulb, seventh largest retail energy company in the country, went bust a little while ago, along with 40 other retail energy companies, I might add, but was regarded as too large to fail, was taken effectively nationalised by government in special administration, has sat there for quite a while at the cost to taxpayers of about £3.5 billion, and has now just recently been, as it were, sold for scrap in terms of its customers being transferred to Octopus Energy for, we think, a consideration of several hundred million, far, far below the money that taxpayers put in to that particular episode of government reacting to appallingly bad regulation in the recent future. And I will be interested to know from the Minister, by the way, whether he has any further information about exactly how much Octopus did pay for the remains of Bulb, so that we can actually get an accurate grip on exactly what money has been retrieved from that episode by government recently. And we also know in the energy bill that is supposed to be upcoming but has mysteriously been withdrawn just recently by central government, it is proposed that the operator of the national transmission system is fully detached from National Grid and is placed in the public sector and is no longer, even at a distance, a part of National Grid. The future system operator, as set out in the bill, will have full power to plan the system, to commission investments in the system, to run and balance the system overall in the public sector. But, as I say, that bill has mysteriously disappeared, so I'd be interested to know from the Minister whether he continues to support the idea that the future system operator is actually a company in the public sector and not a private sector company. And indeed, I would be very interested to hear from the Minister when exactly he intends that the energy bill is actually going to return, if at all, because it contains a great deal of things which actually could lead to the better regulation of the system, which is exactly what the government is saying is the alternative to nationalising the energy system. Now, whilst it is true that part of the answer to the particular problems we have in the energy system at the moment is proper regulation, and there's an enormous amount of work the government would have to do to actually get the system properly regulated, it's also true that we've actually got to look carefully at where our energy system is going now and why the way our energy system is going now will not succeed in getting to the targets it needs to get to, particularly in a low-carbon context, by simply carrying on with a privatised experiment of the last 30 years that we have had. And of course, the energy system is changing before our very eyes. All the old considerations about 80 or so power stations providing power for the grid and then to customers through retail sales are effectively disappearing. We have 1.5 million now inputs who are owned by all sorts of different people. A substantial part, or some of that inputs, indeed, from companies and bodies that are not in the private sector. They are community owned, they are locally owned, they are all sorts of generators providing a different form of input to the grid. And the grid itself, of course, is changing rapidly. National Grid ESO, which is a forerunner of the future system operator set out in the energy bill, considered in a holistic design plan just recently that in order to accommodate the new way the energy system is going to work, it would require a huge system of recalibrating the grid system, both onshore and offshore, probably at the cost of about £62 billion to make sure that the system in the future works well. So we've got an enormous amount of investment that has to take place in order to make the future energy system secure. We have an enormous amount of investment to undertake to get the green and low carbon generators into the system for the future. And I don't think that is going to be sorted out entirely by hoping somehow that the market is going to come to the rescue and provide all that investment for the future on the basis of the regulation and the system we have at the moment. And my honourable friends who have contributed to this debate this afternoon, the honourable member for Wirral West, the honourable member for Leeds East, and the honourable member for Ilford South, have all pointed to the way that maybe needs to be done. And actually we don't do it just by relying on the private sector to hopefully come to the rescue and get all this future system sorted out. We on the Labour side have said already that we want to see a great British energy company, which is a publicly owned company at the heart of the investment and the drive forward and the planning and the management of that new energy system. And that company, as indeed my honourable friends have pointed out, would stand alongside the companies elsewhere in Europe that have already started that energy revolution, not just in their own countries, but on an international scale with their investments. Companies such as Vattenfall in Sweden, which now owns the largest onshore wind farm in the UK, Ørsted in Denmark, Equinor in Norway, a number of other companies of that kind across Europe, which are making those investments in the future system, and by the way, keeping the equity in those investments for the people of the countries they are working on behalf of, and turning those investments over for the people of the countries they are working on behalf of, either individually or in partnership with the private sector, but keeping their equity in those companies. And in this country at the moment, for example, we are actually, as members of the public, as customers, spending enormous amounts of money each year in providing energy companies, in this case transmission and distribution companies, with vast amounts of money to invest in the grid system, the assets of which then stay with those companies when we, the public, have paid for those assets to be brought forward. And just as it's being proposed, by the way, for the new nuclear programme, that we pay the money, they get the asset in the original, in the eventualities. So a great British energy company would put a stop to all that, that actually the assets would stay with the public and the money that would come from it would come back to the public purse. And that seems to me the right way we need to discuss this debate in terms of what is our investment ought to be our product for the future of our energy systems. And I really just reject the government's idea that all of this is going to happen by some better regulation. It would be nice if it did happen, and the operation of the market. We need to be much smarter in thinking about this than that, and that is why, whilst I don't agree that one should nationalise the energy system as it stands, among other things, if you did nationalise a lot of the junk and clapped out stuff that there is in the energy market at the moment, I would think a number of those people who own those assets would be delighted to have those, what will be stranded assets and assets put out to grass very shortly as the energy system changes, and would be pleased that it was off their hands and they could run off with the money from the compensation. So we've got to think smartly about the future of our systems, and our systems will certainly not be funded, run or sorted out on the basis of the failed privatisation experiment that we've had for the last 30 years.
Minister George Freeman.
Well, thank you, Mrs Murray. It's a great pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, and may I take this opportunity to say what a pleasure it is to be back on the front bench after the turmoil of the last few months. Let me first start by congratulating the honourable member for Linlithgow and East Falkirk for securing this debate today, and indeed David and the 100,000 public petitioners who have triggered this debate here today. As an open Democrat, I welcome the fact that the public are able to trigger debates, and I think it's important that we respond, and I'm glad that the public will be able to see the response both in live, real time and recorded. And I want to thank the other honourable members for their contributions to the debate, and very grateful to all those who have taken interest in today's topic. The petition received over 100,000 signatures, and for those listening, it calls on the government to do two things: set out a coherent 25-year plan for UK energy security and strategy, and to take back ownership of our strategic energy assets. And I'm delighted to be replying this afternoon on behalf of the Minister for Energy and Climate Change as the Minister for Science, Technology, Research and Innovation in the department. Let me just put everyone out of their misery of expectation and anxiety about what I might say. I absolutely agree that we need a 25-year coherent plan for energy, which is why the government is has put just that in place. I also agree that we need to be thinking much more strategically about our energy security, resilience, and our energy economy. But I don't, and the government doesn't agree, that nationalisation is the right way to achieve the objectives that I think many of us, but not all of us, share. And I say this, Ms Murray, not in a spirit of complacency at all. I think it's fair to say, and I certainly believe, that successive governments over the last 40-odd years have taken cheap energy rather for granted and haven't foreseen the urgency of decarbonising our energy supply, nor the geopolitical perils of being dependent on overseas suppliers, often from some either hostile or unsavoury regimes. And I'll just finish this list, if I may. I also think it's important that I approach this with no ideology either. I think all parties have had their problems in the past. In the 70s, I would argue that the Labour Party, 60s and 70s, was rather heavily dominated by the union barons, and the nationalised industry didn't do anything nearly enough to promote innovation. I noticed no Liberal Democrat members here today, but I happen to think that their and the SNP's tribal opposition to nuclear leaves them playing one club, golf. And the truth is, I don't think there are any easy solutions to this, but I don't want to dismiss the urgency of the problem, so I'll happily give way.
Thank the Minister for giving way. He's talking about a 25-year strategy. Could he explain to us what the thinking is, or was, and presumably still is, around allowing companies to shield 91% of their profits from a windfall tax that was designed to tax their profits if they then invested in fossil fuels, given that we're facing a climate emergency?
Well, I'll happily set out the explanation for opposition, which I think will deal with that point. If it doesn't, I'm sure the Energy Minister will want to follow up with her. But the central point is this: we believe profoundly that the way to deliver a low-carbon, net-zero, sustainable, resilient British energy market and supply chain is to harness the market and to harness the enterprise, the investment, the leadership and the management excellence of the free market, but not in a way that is untrammelled. And I would argue, and I will in a moment, set out how the approach we've taken isn't at all about the free market. It's about harnessing the market with a lot of regulations and a lot of shape and structure to harness the genius of the market to public ends, which is a difference, fundamental difference. Yes, I'll give way.
I think the Minister giving way has been very generous with his time, but if you're talking about harnessing the market, but you're talking specifically directing that investment at fossil fuels. How do you square that, or how does the Minister square that with, you know, our need to meet net zero? It doesn't seem to make sense.
Well, I think I will deal with that point as I come on to explain our position on net zero and the extraordinary success that the market, with appropriate regulation, has made. Mr. Murray, perhaps I could just make some progress. I have hardly even got through my first paragraph and taken 3 interventions. Okay.
Having way again. But just on that combination of energy resilience and his point about harnessing the market, we know going forward for energy resilience we need long duration storage. That can be provided by pumped storage hydro, a technology that already exists. SSE have got all the permission in place to build a new pumped storage hydro scheme at Corrie Glass, 1.5 gigawatt output. They've got all the private investment there, so we're talking about harnessing the market. Private investment's there. All that's needed is the government to negotiate a cap and floor price mechanism for the sale of electricity. Will they commit officials to speaking with SSE and other operators in the pumped storage hydro market to bring these schemes forward?
Well, I'm grateful to the honourable member for that. I did make clear I'm not the Energy Minister, so I'm not about to make that commitment on my right honourable friend's behalf, but I will make the undertaking that he'll follow up that point, a very specific point, with him. Ms Murray, if I can just make a little bit of progress and summarise, not least for those listening and watching, the background to this debate and where we've been in British energy policy. Almost 4 decades have passed since the privatisation of the British energy system began, long enough that I can forgive all those watching who may have forgotten why the original decision was taken. Back in the 1970s, our nationalised industries were run by government, along with many others, and they were in a very bad state, not least the energy industry. These inefficient monopolies were leaking cash, and they needed much more money to upgrade their age-old and similarly leaky infrastructure. And privatisation, beginning in the 1980s, has completely transformed that situation. I'm not suggesting the energy market is perfect, is functioning perfectly, but it has transformed that situation. I think one of the things that was a shame about the debate is that there's been so little balance, so little reference to any of the successes of any private industry. Indeed, at times it sounded like a pretty Corbynite litany of anti-capitalist, anti-business complaints. The truth is this debate needs some balance, and I'm not saying the energy market is perfect, but let's at least acknowledge the extraordinary progress in the last few years. Since privatisation, no, I'm going to make some progress. Since then, the UK's energy sector has attracted around 20 billion a year in private capital investment into our energy infrastructure, money that would otherwise have had to come from higher taxes or additional borrowing, policies that the opposition may prefer, but we prefer to try and secure private capital to secure those public goods. And the cost of transporting a unit of electricity in that time, Ms Murray, has fallen by 17% since the 1990s, while investment has increased. So energy efficiency has gone up, reliability has gone up, customer service has improved, it's still not perfect, and the number of power cuts has almost halved. These are the real lived experiences of people over the last 30, 40 years of privatisation. And finally, current market arrangements have allowed massive decarbonisation of our energy system with dramatic drops in the cost of renewables. And I think it's worth just making the point that between 1990 and 2019, we grew the UK economy by 76%, and we cut our emissions by over 44%, decarbonising faster than any other G7 country. I mean, that is an extraordinary achievement, and it's an achievement secured by the private sector working in partnership with government. And there's more. In the last 15 years, not only have we led the way in decarbonisation, we've led the way in many of the specific areas of clean energy and put it at the heart of the UK's commitment to reduce emissions as we expand our economy. Personally, having arrived here elected in 2010, I would have liked to have seen the then coalition and the Lib Dem run Department of Energy and Climate Change take the opportunity then of a buy one, get 5 free nuclear deal and double and modernise our nuclear capacity, which would at that time, the complaint from the Lib Dems was partly their religious opposition to anything nuclear, seemingly mirrored by the SNP, but also they thought it would take too long to come on stream. Well, I've got news for listeners, it would have been on stream now. We would have had a high quality, green, resilient supply of nuclear energy for one more generation, guaranteeing clean, green, resilience, guaranteeing many jobs in Scotland, and allowing us then to use this period to invest in the range of renewables, which honourable members have hardly mentioned. I'll come to in a minute. So I think the truth is, nobody can look back and say this was all easy. A lot of mistakes have been made. The truth is our net zero strategy is the most comprehensive of its kind, and the British Energy Security Strategy sets out extra ambitions to those we set out in 2010. It's aimed to and is on track to secure 480,000 well-paid jobs by the end of the 2030s, unlocking 100 billion in private investment by 2030 and mobilising 30 billion of government investment. I mean, this is not the free market with no support from government. This is a massive programme of government in partnership with the private sector, and that's why we're able to and have driven down emissions at the fastest rate in the G7. Yes, I'll happily give way.
Would the Minister agree that, as has been suggested in this debate, that quite a lot of that investment that has been achieved for future energy, and indeed is coming in now, is from precisely those companies that are representative of other states in Europe putting forward that investment? And so you could say the Minister would be quite happy for a publicly owned investment to take place in this country, provided it is not from the UK. Is that a right conclusion to come to?
I'm honestly not totally sure I understand the question. I think the central point is, in a modern global economy, I don't think anyone really, other than sort of political dinosaurs, would think that you can ring-fence all investment to only from one country. We live in a global economy, and I think that's all to the good, and this country benefits hugely from that investment. One of the huge risks of the renationalisation that is being proposed is that it would destroy confidence internationally in investors coming into the UK. And that is something we have to think very seriously about. We don't have a right to attract international investment. We need to be competitive. And I think this debate has rather lacked that point. We're a world leader, Ms Murray, in offshore wind, with an ambition to deliver up to 50 gigawatts of offshore wind power by 2030, including 5 of floating wind, something which is something to be proud of. And in my part of the world, in East Anglia, the southern North Sea is rapidly becoming the Saudi Arabia of wind energy. And with proper interconnected offshore grid connectors, we'll be able to use off-peak energy to generate green hydrogen. This is an exciting development, and it's all been provided by the market, not the free and untrammeled market of profiteering stereotype, but the market, businesses investing in partnership with government. We continue to break records in renewable energy, which has more than quadrupled since 2010, with low-carbon electricity overall now giving us over 50% of our total generation. It would have been nice to hear members at least pay tribute to this achievement rather than attack the profiteering businesses who have been at the front line of actually delivering this. And we've installed 90% of our solar capacity in this country, 90% since 2010. That's enough for 3 million homes. This has happened by, no, I'm going to make some progress for now. This has happened by harnessing the power of the market. I don't think anyone would suggest this has been an untrammeled free market. I'm not here to make that case, others may. This has been a partnership of private and public sector. And that's why the government continues to believe that properly regulated markets, and I've written widely and spoken widely about how the opportunity of Brexit for us to set our own regulatory standards, not in a race to the bottom, but in a race to the top, setting the standards in smart grid, in digital energy, and in new forms of energy, a huge opportunity for us to use that freedom, to incentivise private capital to invest in the energy system, provide the best outcomes for consumers, and promote market competition as the drivers of efficiency, innovation, and value. And we believe profoundly on this side of the House that actually private ownership of energy assets, properly regulated, improves performance and reliability and offers consumers greater choice and higher standards of products and services. No market is perfect. There are always payoffs and balances, but it is very difficult to see how the sort of nationalisation, particularly, dare I say, as it's been set out this afternoon, with no detail of how it will work, vague assumptions that there'll be lots of money, it'll only come in the end from taxation or borrowing, and very little understanding of how it would actually be done. Anyone listening to this debate hasn't seriously heard a proposal for how nationalisation would happen, simply a ragtag of arguments against the private sector and against business. And we strongly think that this argument becomes even more important when you look at the global market and the international energy market in which we find ourselves. The truth is that these days no energy market exists in isolation. We don't exist in a vacuum. The pandemic and the war in Ukraine have revealed painfully the interdependence of our global energy supplies. We're not in a position where we can unilaterally declare UDI from the global markets, and any renationalised energy company would still have to buy its gas on the global market at the same price. There's no way of getting around that. But it does heighten the urgency of reducing our dependency on foreign actors, on hostile states, on those who may use their energy power to exercise geopolitical influence on us. So we are absolutely committed, as we've set out, to diversifying our energy supply and our resilience. We understand that sky-high global energy prices caused by Russia's appalling invasion of Ukraine are having real consequences for consumers' bills across the country, exacerbating the real consequences of the pandemic shutdown of the global economy and refiring up and opening, which has driven inflation into the system. European gas prices have soared by more than 200% last year, and coal prices by more than 100%, leading to an inevitable increase in the cost of living, the cost of energy, which drives the cost of living across our economy. And that's why our British energy security strategy is absolutely committed to and is already implementing the support for our diverse sources of homegrown energy to provide greater energy security in the longer term. Let me just unpack that. We've set out, firstly, a comprehensive long-term plan, just as the motion calls for, to 2050 for our energy system in the 2020 10-point plan for a green industrial revolution and the energy white paper. It needed doing, it's been done, and the British energy, secondly, security strategy, published in April this year, charts a pathway to reducing our vulnerability to international energy prices by reducing our dependence on imported oil and gas. We'll achieve our ambitions by accelerating the deployment of wind, solar and new nuclear energy and supercharging our production of low-carbon hydrogen, and within my portfolio, Mrs Murray, supporting next-generation energy sources, including fusion and small modular nuclear. And we'll support North Sea oil and gas in the near term for security of supply and the important work that's being done in Scotland, particularly for North Sea transition, to turn that infrastructure into the infrastructure for clean, green energy. Thirdly, we will ensure a more flexible and efficient system for both generators and users, undertaking our comprehensive review of electricity market arrangements to ensure that consumers fully benefit from the next phase of our energy transformation. And that's why we've committed to publishing, with Ofgem, a strategic framework this year on how networks will deliver net zero. Fourth, we're also not just thinking about reforming energy supply. We have an ambitious programme of energy efficiency measures to lower demand and to bring down bills and emissions too. But nationalisation will not solve or help tackle these challenges for a number of reasons. Firstly, as I've said, nationalised energy companies would still have to buy gas on the international markets. There's no price reduction that comes with being nationalised. Secondly, if the Labour, or more likely perhaps a Labour SNP Lib Dem coalition committed to renationalisation came into office, the British taxpayer, their measures would mean we have to compensate directors, shareholders and creditors to the tune, I'll just finish this list, of tens of billions of pounds, money that would otherwise be spent on schools and hospitals and public services. And thirdly, the sort of nationalisation that's been talked about blithely but not explained here this afternoon would have a hugely damaging effect on our ability to attract the international investment that I've set out, which is key to delivering net zero. I'll happily give way.
I thank the Minister for giving way. I think the Minister is actually either not hearing what is being said on this side, or is actually going out of his way to put it in an entirely different light. Neither the Scottish nationalists nor our side have said that we want to renationalise the whole of the energy industry. What we have said is that different ways of working in the future from the complete market fetishism that has been going on would actually be much better for investment from the private sector, for example, by having a partner in government to bring it forward, and a reliable partner, and a partner that actually can, among other things, bring the cost of capital down and so on. That's very different from what the Minister is talking about in his discussion this afternoon.
It is. It's also very different from, as the record will show, what members opposite actually said. I sat for an hour and listened to a reheated hash of the same old anti-capitalist, anti-business, easy. Yes, I did, and the record will show it. Those interested in how we might build a modern energy economy will observe that there were very little detail on how nationalisation will be done, very little said about innovation, about new sectors, about how we create all the exciting areas of innovation, how we use the smart grid, how we create a network of incentives and penalties and rewards and points, how we empower consumers. None of that. It was a litany of the same old Labour and SNP, anti-business, anti-capitalist talk of profiteering companies. They are, by the way, the same companies that pay dividends into the pension funds of our constituents, probably the trade union barons who are lobbying for this nationalisation. It is old-fashioned economics that's been proven not to work. I was hoping to come this afternoon and hear, no, I've had enough of giving away. All you're doing is repeating the same points that we've already listened to, and I want to make some progress. I want to turn to the winter support for energy bills, which is a really important issue, and it's part of the second half of the motion. We are absolutely committed to reducing the impact of these terrible global events that I've described and the impact of the war in Ukraine and the reopening of the global economy after the pandemic on people's bills. We absolutely, as this Prime Minister and the two previous Prime Ministers have made clear, absolutely committed to helping the British public through this, and we're taking action at an unprecedented scale. Firstly, our energy price guarantee will save a typical British household around £700 this winter. This comes on top of the £37 billion package of support announced earlier this year, which will give all households circa £400 off their energy bills through the Energy Bill Support Scheme. That means a typical household saving around £1,100. And we're taking further targeted action to ensure that the most vulnerable can stay warm this winter. Thirdly, the UK's poorest families will continue to receive £1,200 of support, including £400 from the Energy Bill Support Scheme, provided in instalments over the year, with additional support for pensioners and those claiming disability benefits. Fourth, the government is also investing over £6.6 billion across this Parliament in critical work to improve energy efficiency and decarbonise heating, and will deliver upgrades to over 500,000 homes in the coming years through our social housing decarbonisation, home upgrade grant schemes and energy company obligation scheme, delivering average bill savings of £300. And fifthly, we've extended the energy company obligation from 22 to 26, boosting its value from 640 million to £1 billion a year, helping an extra 450,000 families with green measures such as insulation. And sixth, it's not just households, we're also taking action to support schools, hospitals and businesses through the new Energy Bill Relief Scheme. The government will provide a discount on wholesale gas and electricity prices for all non-domestic consumers in Great Britain and Northern Ireland. And Mrs Murray, this is not the sort of free market, laissez-faire, devil take the hindmost economics that's been portrayed this afternoon. This is a government taking huge and unprecedented steps on a scale with those we took in the pandemic to help families, households, businesses, charities deal with this global cost of living crisis. And again, it would have been nice to hear some reference from the benches opposite to the immensity of that package. I want to come then to energy profits, which honourable members opposite have raised. We aren't just cutting bills in the short term. We're thinking about how we can guarantee an affordable, clean and secure supply of energy for this winter and beyond. And we have listened closely to the public debate around the profits enjoyed by energy generators thanks to high international gas prices. We haven't just listened, we've acted. And that's why in May we introduced a 25% surcharge on extraordinary profits in the oil and gas sector, which will raise about £5 billion over the next year. And that revenue will support our support for those hardest hit by the rise in the cost of living and cost of energy. We've brought forward primary legislation to give us powers to deliver a temporary revenue limit for renewable generation in the wholesale market. And the details of that proposal will be set out in subsequent secondary legislation, and we're committed to collaborating closely with industry to develop it further. And this will return a substantial amount of excess profits made through this price surge to consumers via suppliers. Yes, I'll have to give way.
Thank you for giving way. To get some sort of level playing field, why isn't a renewable energy investment allowance that allows tax write-offs for greater investment in renewable energy, but yet there is for oil and gas? It just makes no sense if he's talking about having a cleaner, greener system going forward.
Well, I just refer the honourable gentleman to the facts as I've set them out. We are attracting billions of investment into clean energy, into a whole raft of new renewables, and I don't think anyone would argue that the UK is struggling to attract international investment. What we need to do, which I completely accept, is to accelerate the deployment not just of wind and solar, but to continue to invest in the technologies of tomorrow to ensure that we're able to increase global and UK energy supply for a modern society and economy in a way that is clean, green, smart, and develops those new jobs. And I'm surprised that honourable members opposite aren't more excited by the opportunities for Scotland in this sector, which would be recklessly undermined by an uncosted, unthought-through plan for both nationalisation and independence, without credibility for how those plans are going to be funded. And that's why our energy security strategy does set out a long-term plan for the whole of the UK that reduces our vulnerability to international energy prices by reducing our dependence on imported oil and gas. We absolutely, Ms Murray, know this is a very difficult time for families and businesses who are struggling, and it's a matter of genuine public concern, as this petition shows, and rightly so. But I hope that I've reassured both honourable members present and the constituents that they nobly represent that we are addressing this issue with the seriousness it deserves. Yes, I'll happily give way.
Thank the Minister for giving way. He's been very generous with his time. Recent reports are showing that people on prepayment meters there's a lot of people not taking up the support. What steps can his government make to make sure that 100% of people can take up the support that they need? Because my big concern is that actually the most vulnerable people will struggle in that situation.
Yeah, the Honourable Lady makes an important point about the particular circumstances of those on prepayment and those at the those who are most prone to energy poverty and vulnerability. And again, I'm not the Energy Minister, so I, with permission, will allow my Right Honourable friend, the Energy Minister, to follow up that point with her. This is, Mrs Murray, a long journey. It's a journey that we, I think as a country, started a little late, but we have led the world in moving at pace, and that's a tribute to, I think, all of the parties involved. To be fair, the last Labour government before 2010 started some important measures. We in the coalition took it forward, and then the Conservative governments have pursued it at pace since. And I believe that we are on the road to success, and I have no doubt that consumers will be at the heart of government policy every step of the way. Right now, that means we're focused on doing all we can to support consumers through this very difficult winter ahead. But nationalisation is not the right solution. And I would just say, it has been rather extraordinary for me here this afternoon to see how strongly the old anti-capitalist politics of the hard left have been shown to continue to thrive in the Labour Party and in the SNP. We've heard eons about anti-business, millionaires, profiteering, no talk about companies generating the profits that drive dividends, that supply pensioners with revenue, or public sector workers with their pensions, or the trade unions with theirs for that matter. We've heard nothing from the SNP seriously about how they would pay for independence, which has traditionally been based on their own assumptions on the revenues from oil and gas. They're anti-nuclear, they appear to be anti-everything that will score a point, but there's no serious and costed plan for how Scotland could be in the vanguard of the new energy economy. And the Lib Dems themselves, not present here today either, have described Labour's policy of nationalisation as pointless and costly. I honestly believe that...
I'm very annoyed about this.
Minister.
Thank you, Ms Murray. Nothing today have we heard on the really exciting opportunities in our energy sector, the new renewables, the marine, the tidal, the geothermal, the hydrogen, the fusion that this government and I as Minister for Research am supporting, the opportunities for the UK clean tech sector, the small companies and large in the front line of developing global solutions for new energy. Smart grid, nothing about the importance of incentives and the digitalisation of the grid to create a micro market and bring net zero down to the ground in different communities, and very little about energy use, a lot about generation, but very little about how transport and agriculture, the two big industries on the front line of energy usage, are making huge strides in decreasing their reliance. And instead, we've heard quite a lot of old dogma of decline. I think, to be honest, that answers, Ms Murray, why there are so few other colleagues from different parties here this afternoon. Most are more interested in trying to develop the practical solutions. And I honestly think the 100,000 people who petitioned for a proper debate about long-term energy strategy deserve something slightly better, and the government is absolutely determined to provide it.
Mr Martyn Day, 2 minutes to wind up.
Thank you very much, Mrs Murray. incredibly grateful to the members who came along today, and may I express my thanks to them on behalf of the Petitions Committee for doing so. I hope that the petitioners and those watching feel that we have at least opened the debate into this area. I think we've got a long way to go before we satisfy the concerns that have been raised. The Minister spoke about exciting opportunities, and I have to say, with families in my constituency and throughout the country facing a choice of either perhaps starving to death or freezing to death this winter, that is not exciting. That is terrifying. The energy market is broken beyond repair, and it needs urgent action. We're not out of this crisis yet we have still no clarification from this government as to its future plans for energy support past April next year. Yeah. That's what the public want to know. And until we get solutions to that, we'll need to re-look at these issues to find a solution that works for the long term for everyone in this country, not just the well-to-do millionaires and the profiteers. We need action that helps people on the ground now. Yeah. Thank you.
Is that this House has considered E-petition 608056 relating to public ownership of energy companies. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. To the contrary, no. The ayes have it. The ayes have it. Order, order. The sitting stands adjourned.